Today I'll talk about biotechnology and bioengineered food. Biotechnology refers to a variety of techniques that use and manipulate living organisms to make commercial products. Biotechnology includes tissue culturing, cloning, and genetic engineering, such as gene splicing and insertion. In traditional plant breeding, crosses were made between plants through cross-fertilization. Using this method, you cannot cross with animals or with very different plants, one to another. In the top left, you see an illustration of traditional crossbreeding. Many apple varieties, such as the Honeycrisp, were developed in this way. However, a type of biotechnology includes mutagenesis, where you use radiation and other either physical or chemical mutagens to produce random mutations in plants that activate new desirable varieties. This process helped deepen the color of the ruby red and star ruby grapefruits. And in the bottom, an illustration of gene editing using CRISPR or TALEN, which targets specific locations within the plant's genome or DNA and allows for precise edits or deletions. Low gluten wheat is something that has been created using this tool. So scientists can now move genes coding for a certain characteristic from one organism to another, including from animals to plants. For example, firefly genes have been spliced onto tobacco, resulting in the glowing tobacco seedling that you see on the right. And flounder genes have been moved into soybeans. The Institute for Responsible Technology maintains a list of some of these. So, for example, spider genes inserted into goat DNA, or Arctic fish genes inserted into tomatoes and strawberries to produce tolerance to frost. Perhaps most surprising are the number of plants that have had human genes inserted, and that includes corn and sugarcane and rice. So how does this happen? Well, you take one or two genes from a foreign DNA, either from a bacteria, an animal, another plant, or a synthesized gene. You link it to a reporter gene, which is often an antibiotic-resistant gene, and other DNA sequences that are needed for insertion. This chimera is spliced into a bacterial plasmid and then inserted into a viral or bacterial vector. So what I'm talking about here is the process, and the process includes often antibiotic-resistant genes, which concerns me, or bacteria, or viral vectors. To insert into the plant, you can either infect the plant with the bacteria or the virus, or you can use mechanical means, such as electric shock or a gene gun. This illustrates using a gene gun. So you cut out the gene, in this case an insect resistance gene. You insert it into a vector with a selectable antibiotic resistance marker gene. You copy that into the bacteria, and you coat tungsten or gold particles with these chimera, and you load these onto Teflon bullets. You load the bullet into a gene gun, and believe it or not, you shoot it at high velocity into plant cells. This then pushes the vector into the cell, and these genes that you've cut out from somewhere else are now incorporated into the plant's DNA. The cells are plated on a selective antibiotic media, and only cells that have incorporated the vector will grow. And then these are transferred to a medium containing plant growth factors, and eventually you have the plant. Here's another cartoon showing how GM crops are made, or genetically modified crops. So identify an organism with the desired characteristics, such as Bacillus thuringiensis, a bacterium that produces a protein that kills specific insects. Cut out the length of DNA that produces this protein, transfer it into the plant you want to protect, either by firing it in with the gene gun or infecting it through soil bacteria. According to the Law Library of Congress, the United States does not have any federal legislation that is specific to genetically modified organisms. Rather, genetically modified organisms are regulated pursuant to health, safety, and environmental legislation that governs conventional products. And the U.S. approach to regulating genetically modified organisms is premised on the assumption that regulation should focus on the nature of the products rather than the process in which they were produced. That is the process that I've just described. Compared to other countries, regulation of genetically modified organisms in the U.S. is relatively favorable to their development, and the U.S. is the world's leading producer of genetically modified crops by far. So in the USA, who regulates genetically engineered or genetically modified organisms? Well, the USDA regulates that the plants are safe to grow. The Food and Drug Administration regulates that foods from these plants are safe for humans and for animals to eat. And the Environmental Protection Agency regulates that the pesticides in these plants are safe for human and animal consumption and for the environment. Notice I said pesticides in these plants. A new genetically modified crop requires an environmental release permit, and the very first of these was issued in 1986 in Belgium. And by 1992, 393 permits had been released. The first approved and permitted plant in the United States was in 1996. And of the approximately 860 initial total releases, only 87 were not food related, and those were mostly tobacco. So by far, most of these releases, at least through the first 860, were for food. Worldwide, the top 10 genetically modified foods include dairy products, canola, which of course makes canola oil, cottonseed, used for cottonseed oil, corn, which is in almost every product in America, potatoes, peas, soy, tomatoes, and papaya. And in the United States, currently 10 genetically modified crops are approved to be grown. These include squash, soybean, corn, and that's corn grown both for animal feed and for humans, cotton, papaya, canola, alfalfa, sugar beets, potato, and apple. And what are the genetic traits that were inserted into these 10 crops? Let's look first at corn, which is listed here twice. Insect resistance and herbicide tolerance were the main traits injected, and for field corn also drought tolerance. So how is field corn used? Well, it's used in high fructose corn syrup and other sweeteners. It's used in corn oil, in starch, in cereal and other food products, and alcohol. And of course, it's also used for livestock and poultry feed and industrial uses. So of course, even though animals are eating it, we are then eating the meat of those animals. Now, sweet corn is bred, has genes inserted for insect resistance and herbicide tolerance. So if you look through all these, they're pretty much all for herbicide tolerance, some for insect resistance, and for two of them, apple and potato, non-browning. And I'll talk more about the potato in a few minutes. So the number one trait that's being added to these potential foods is herbicide tolerance. This harks back to the talk that I've already given on the Plant Variety Protection Act and how that's resulted in major international petrochemical companies buying up all the seed companies because they are now breeding seeds to resist their herbicides and to be packaged with their herbicides, and only 8% for product quality. Beginning in 1993 in the United States, a new streamlined notification process for 6 crops went into effect, and that was for corn, cotton, potato, soybean, tomato, and tobacco. And these could get fast-track approval for growing outdoors in the fields within 30 days. And of course, faster approval means that the public would know less about what genetic modifications are being tested. I believe this past year, a number of crops, and it might be these same 6, have yet even more release of regulations, and I didn't go ahead and read them, but there's yet more going on with this story. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that isolated genes and genetically modified plant varieties can be patented, and other countries followed suit. Now this is a bit out of date, this list, but who applies for the most patents? It's petrochemical companies for the most part. Some of these companies listed here now are part of other companies. However, the Supreme Court recently ruled out gene patents. Despite that, genetically modified organism companies are still being granted patent rights on complementary DNA. That is DNA that's a variation of the original gene. Now, on average, it costs about $136 million to discover, develop, and authorize a new genetically modified organism plant. Therefore, of course, the people who develop it want to be the sole suppliers of that seed. And the patent is for 20 years. So for 20 years, no one else is allowed to sell that seed. And you're not allowed to save your seed to grow yourself the next year. So patents can be for methods, they can be for these complementary genes, and they can be for plant varieties. And again, as I've already spoken, when I talked about the Plant Variety Protection Act, these varieties to be patented, must be genetically uniform. That is, to have very little genetic variability, which makes them a very dangerous thing for us to have, because our entire food supply could be wiped out should a pest successfully attack that genetically uniform variety. So only the United States, the European Patent Office, Australia, and Japan allow the patenting of plant varieties. And the greatest acreage of genetically modified crops is by far grown in the United States. Here you see the United States in recent years. This is 2017, the most recent I could get online. Grows 75 million hectares of genetically modified crops. The next closest country at 50.2 million is Brazil. And by far, most of the countries who are growing genetically modified crops are often growing 1.1 million or less hectares. And this shows that from 2016 to 2017, there was a 3% increase in the area devoted to biotech crops. This chart is a little bit more recent. It goes up through 2019, showing from 1996 to 2019 the amount of acres or percent of planted acres devoted to either herbicide tolerant soybeans, cotton, or corn, or Bacillus thuringiensis infected soybeans, cotton, or corn. And you can see that in all cases, it looks like it's about 80% up into the high 90% of the acres of these crops are genetically modified for either one of these indications. So are they herbicide tolerant? Are they insect resistant because they have the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis? These biosafety web pages talk about or list the various kinds of risks that could occur for animal and human health. So things we could worry about would include toxicity and food quality and safety, allergies, and what concerns me most of all, pathogen drug resistance, that is antibiotic resistance, given the process that is being used to infect these cells to make these genetically modified plants. And the worry that we already have a lot of antibiotic resistance among humans, is this going to contribute to it, or is it already contributing to it? Currently, the genetically modified organism potato, sometimes called White Russet, is being marketed, and it was introduced to grocery stores in 2015. And this potato is bred to not show bruising. The problem is, among other things, is that even though bruising doesn't show up, it's still bruised. And so you may be eating something that's damaged or actually has bacteria in it, but you can't see it. And actually, in late 2018, the scientist who developed this potato renounced his work and calls the potato a health risk. And this is Dr. Caius Ramans. And I found something he said very interesting. He said that the standard tests needed to ensure regulatory approval are not set up to identify unintended effects. Instead, they are meant to confirm the safety of a GM crop and not to question their safety. Some potential risks for the environment would be persistency of the gene or transgene. So do you get volunteers? Does it invade? What are the accumulative effects? The susceptibility of non-target organisms. And we already know that some of these are being transferred to unintended plants. So genetically modified corn, downwind from it, organic corn. Some of those genes are showing up in the organic corn, which the farmer growing them does not want. But his crop is being infected by corn that is nearby. Also, increased use of chemicals in agriculture, because of course the whole point of petrochemical companies patenting plant varieties is that you package them with your chemicals, and they are bred to withstand your herbicides that all other plants, including the milkweeds that has led to a decrease in the monarch butterfly population, they all die. Only the plants that are bred to withstand it live. And then a worry about unpredictable gene expression or transgene instability. This has been a concern with the release of transgenic mosquitoes. So in our effort to try to stop things like the Zika virus or malaria, releasing mosquitoes that are sterile and that when they breed with other mosquitoes make them sterile. And the worry about the down the line effects, like how is this going to affect populations of other animals like birds that depend on these mosquitoes for food. What are the risks for agriculture, such as resistance or tolerance of target organisms? Or are we creating superweeds? Or are we altering the nutritional value? And general concerns, that is the loss of familiarity of the plant. So do we expect every fruit to always look perfect? I think many people do these days. The higher cost of agriculture, because you have to buy the seed each year, you have to buy the chemicals. You're stuck for 20 years, you cannot get that seed from anyone else. And field trials are not planned for risk assessment. And then, of course, the issue facing us in class this week, the ethical issues of labeling. Another concern is horizontal gene transfer, so genetic pollution through pollen or seed dispersal, and we already know that that is happening, and the transfer of the foreign gene to microorganisms. So are we going to get new viruses by recombination? That's a very severe concern. So the first genetically engineered whole product went on the market in 1994. And since then, we've had many other genetically engineered whole product foods. The Grocery Manufacturers Association estimates that 70 to 75% of all processed foods in America may have genetically engineered ingredients. But for years, legislation, backed mostly by Monsanto and other big chemical businesses, fought against labeling products as containing genetically engineered ingredients. And in fact, they even fought against people being able to label that it was not genetically modified. So the Center for Food Safety has a smartphone app. I've had it on my phone for years that allows you to scan the barcode of a product at the grocery store to find out about whether it has genetically engineered ingredients. And I'd have to tell you that many baby foods are genetically engineered. So should genetically modified foods be labeled? This used to be a major topic and a paper in this course, but there's been some news on this front. The first labeling policies were by the European Union in 1997, and about 64 countries currently have labeling regulations. And all countries require labeling products from genetically modified crops that are not substantially equivalent to their conventional counterparts. Now, the key here is the phrase not substantially equivalent, and what is meant by that. For example, if the product has a novel trait, such as being nutritionally enhanced, for example, golden rice, which carries more of vitamin. So here's a slightly out-of-date worldwide map of countries with genetically modified organism food labeling laws. And this was the most up-to-date map that I could find that was so clear. So those countries in red, which shows most of Europe and the Soviet Union and Australia, has mandatory labeling for nearly all genetically modified foods. And that is any food that has anywhere from 0.9 to 1% genetically modified content per ingredient in the food item. So there's basically two ways in which you could decide what needs labeling. So do you need to label by the ingredient, which is what these countries in red do, and with a very low threshold? Or do you label for the entire food item, which is what those countries in gray are doing? And so for them, if it has 1% genetically modified content for the entire food item, it must be labeled. And then those in tan don't have a threshold, but they do have to label some genetically modified foods. Now, what's different is that the United States, as I'll talk about in a minute, now has a new food labeling law. But for us, it's the entire food, and it's way above anybody else's threshold. Over 5% for the entire food is the only thing that will need labeling by 2022. So again, a slightly out-of-date map, all of the countries that require labeling, and two major countries, the United States and Canada, that do not. And the US will then require labeling in 2022. Again, a little bit out of date in terms of the names of these companies, but there are 5 biotech companies in the world producing and selling genetically modified seeds. And even though not all of these companies are American, their genetically modified seed headquarters are all located in America. But for products that are considered to be substantially equivalent, which is virtually all genetically modified products today, we see heterogeneity in labeling. So until recently, the USA had only voluntary labeling, as does still Canada, Hong Kong, and South Africa. Whereas Australia, the European Union, Japan, Brazil, and China have mandatory labeling. And the threshold levels range from 0.9 to 5%. And of course, the new upcoming United States law is over 5% for the entire product, not for individual ingredients. So Congress passed the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard in 2016. And this requires the United States Department of Agriculture to establish a labeling standard for genetically modified food. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that they've changed the terminology. People in the United States were finally starting to recognize the potential dangers or have an outcry for labeling of genetically modified organisms, GMO, or genetically engineered food, GE. So instead of using either of those, they now say the word bioengineered. And these requirements were originally set to take effect by July 2018, but they didn't release the official law until later, and they've only begun to implement it here at the beginning of 2020, and food companies are not required to comply until January 1st of 2022. So again, note the new language. Instead of GMO or GE, which was finally starting to seep into what Americans knew about, it's now called bioengineered. So looking at labeling in general, labeling can be applied to each ingredient, or only the major 3 to 5 ingredients, or only the finished product. So for example, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the USA only labels the finished product. Whereas the European Union, Brazil, and China look at the production process, in which any product derived from genetically modified crops must be labeled, even if it can't be detected in the product. And if you recall from the US Law Library, it says that we do not look at the production process here in the United States. So in the US, the law requires labeling only on bioengineered foods intended for human consumption that contain more than 5% genetically modified ingredients. And you do not have to label foods derived from animals, such as eggs, meat, and milk. So you can be feeding genetically modified feed to animals, or you can be giving them growth hormones to produce more milk, and that does not need to be labeled. Also, you do not have to label refined ingredients like the oils made from soy, corn, canola, which are all genetically engineered, and sugars, which of course the sugar beet is genetically engineered. You do not have to label food served in a restaurant, or foods manufactured and sold by very small manufacturers, or any non-human food products. So what will the new genetically modified or bioengineered labels look like? Well, once put into law in January of 2022, you'll see 3 different labeling methods. Either text on the food packaging. For example, it might say partially produced with genetic engineering, or a symbol that represents bioengineering, and here are the approved symbols, 2 different ones, and each in either black and white or color, or an electronic or digital link that can be scanned. Now, smaller food manufacturers with limited resources may also choose to label their foods using a telephone number that can provide additional information, or an internet URL. One potential label is a QR code, and many products may end up linking with the app called Smart Label. And here's a link to a web page that explains it. You can look up foods on the web page, or you can download the app to your phone and scan a label that looks like this. And it will tell you the ingredients, the allergens, a little bit about the process, but frankly, so far, it's been very difficult to find out about genetic modification from scanning these labels. So what about genetically modified animals? Well, in 2018, scientists announced they had deleted the section of DNA in pigs that leaves them vulnerable to porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome. Now, in the European Union, genetically modified animals are banned from the food chain. But because this is a new and different technique, it's possible that this eventually, bacon and meat from pigs that are genetically edited like this will be allowed. A British company has created genetically modified male mosquitoes that carry a self-limiting gene, and the purpose is to help limit the spread of Zika and malaria. So it's a wonderful purpose, but there is worry about what long-term effect this is going to have on the environment. Cows. Scientists in China and Argentina have engineered cows to produce milk similar in composition to human milk. Now, so far, it's not to a point where it tastes good. Chickens. One company is working on genetically modified chickens that contain an extra gene that interrupts the transmission of avian flu. However, many farmers say you just need to maintain good, clean, sanitary conditions at your chicken farm. Salmon, a very interesting story here. In 2017, the Canadian authorities allowed a genetically modified salmon that had been designed by a U.S. company to be sold as food. And here you see a regular sized salmon up front and the genetically modified salmon, huge looking, behind it. And this salmon is engineered to reach market size in 18 months, which is half the time of its natural counterpart. However, this fish was not being labeled as genetically modified in the shops in Canada. And remember, Canada does not have genetically modified organism food labeling laws. But in November of 2020, the federal court in the United States declared that this salmon is unlawful and that the Food and Drug Administration failed to analyze the risks to endangered salmon from escape of these, so if they crossbred with wild salmon. And this genetically engineered salmon includes DNA from Atlantic salmon, Pacific king salmon, and Arctic Ocean eel pout, an entirely different species. And this marks the first time any government in the world had approved a commercially genetically engineered animal as food, and already here, a couple of years later, it's now unlawful. It needs further testing. So, to end with, some people are concerned about many different issues, like are the workers being paid fairly? Are you killing off other organisms in growing your coffee? So if you're interested in being a socially responsible eater, you can vote with your wallet, as people say, and there's an app called Boycott that you can download. It's an internet-based platform and a smartphone application that reads the universal product barcodes, or the UPCs, on a product. And based on that, it will tell you whether there is a campaign out there in which people are protesting that it's not socially responsible in one way or another. And you can see how many people agree with that assessment. So if you're able to and want to, here's a way for you to find out whether, what are the hidden socially responsible questions about the food that you might buy in the store.